Africa Prime, brought to you by Jamison's Select Reserve.
Welcome back. You are watching Africa Prime, and tonight we are talking to the chairman of the Independent Electoral Commission of South Africa, Advocate Tlakula. When we took off after the break, we discussed how we could make sure the electoral process moves on quickly. But I want to take you back from when you started out. As a young woman, when you're growing up in apartheid South Africa, you know how it was? Yes. When you were growing up, apartheid was everywhere, and the natural outlet for any frustrations that one felt was politics. Did politics ever cross your mind?
Well, we lived in a bad political era during apartheid, so we were affected, all of us, by politics. Sure. Maybe the question should be whether I have ever thought of being an active politician, right, or a career politician. Okay. And not at all. We're all activists in our own way when we grew up during apartheid. But because of the unjustness of that system, what crossed my mind at that time was that I want to be a human rights lawyer. Right.
Very different from Nelson Mandela, who decided to go into politics.
Yes, I didn't go into active politics, but politics touched us at university. I went to the University of the North, and you know, it was also the bastion of resistance, like any other institution of higher learning those days. Yeah,
but why the law?
Because the unjustness of the apartheid system was steeped in law. Right. And for me, that was the turning point to say, right, we have to change these laws to make them just. Okay. And that is why I then, it had always been my ambition to be a human rights lawyer. Yeah. And human rights remains my first love. Even where I am today, I see what I do as the right to vote, for instance. It's a human right. And in order to make that right real, you have to ensure that you accommodate all South Africans in the way that you prepare for an election. Yeah. You have to ensure that your voting material, you have to ensure that your voter education speaks to those who have not gone to school, speaks to those who have a visual impairment, speaks to people who speak different languages, including the marginalized languages like that of indigenous people, the San and the Khoi. So you have to approach it from that, I approach it from the human rights point of view.
Yeah. Now, I suppose when you were growing up with apartheid all around you like that, yes, as you say, so politics was very much a part of it, but you took another route on it. But what else shaped you? Because I remember when I was growing up, one of the things that struck me when I was able to read and write and those kind of things was Mother Teresa, and how she was able to make such huge change in her community. For you, what was it?
Wow, very difficult. What shaped me, believe it or not, was my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, right, who's the person who brought us up, who was a matriarch of note, in a very quiet way. A disciplinarian of note, instilled all the values that I have of hard work, but also of humility. I remember she, like all people those days, was a staunch Christian in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And she used to say to us that, you know, people always fight for positions even in church. And used to have an expression that says that positions will never take you to heaven, because that's not what God looks for. And for me, that was really a mark of humility. And the values of hard work, of discipline, are the values that she inculcated in all of us, her grandchildren. Yeah.
Now, you're taking on a very, very difficult job, and I say very difficult job because we are at that stage in South Africa's history now where perhaps politics more than ever is becoming more contested. Yes. And the probability that the ruling party will try and, you know, protect its turf will come to the fore more and more. But when you look back, before we talk about the challenges that are coming up, when you look back over the years, what did you say has been the biggest challenges that you've faced so far?
You know, before I answer that, let me talk about the ruling party in this country. Sure. The good thing about the ruling party and the government of South Africa is that they leave us alone to do our work. And that's a big credit.
I'm a journalist, I will say so far.
Yes, so far, yes.
So far.
Because, you know, in other countries, you hear that people get telephone calls from the State House. They are called to the State House at night.
It's one of my questions.
But it doesn't happen in this. It hasn't happened. I always, when I hear all those stories, I just get shocked how that happens. Because the government gives us the space to do the work that we're supposed to do. But you are right. As soon as, you know, politics in this country become highly contested, as soon as you're going to have the gap closing between the ruling party and the opposition, that is when I think the character of an election management body is tested.
Sure.
And its ability to walk the talk and to observe the tenets of the Constitution. With us, we're not quite there. We have pockets of that. I mean, if you take the Western Cape, for instance, sure. We have had those situations, and some areas also in the local government where you find that, you know, you're talking about a hang municipality or so. But even in those situations, what is good is whoever is unhappy about anything with the processes will go to a court of law. They will not take the law into their hands. They will not even make us a scapegoat.
Right.
They will just go to a court of law to say, we don't like this, we don't like the decision that was taken by the Electoral Commission, or force a court of law to take a decision which will compel us to do certain things. Right. And we welcome that.
Yeah, and I suppose, well, I hope that call doesn't come through one day. But I asked this question because when I was researching for this interview, one of the things that I saw was that as chairman, you are appointed for a period of 7 years.
Yes.
After the period of 7 years, the president has the liberty to reappoint or not to reappoint. Yeah. If the president decides not to reappoint, what mechanisms are there to protect the independence of the electoral process, to ensure that if you do something that the president doesn't like and you are not reappointed, what recourse to the public that have invested and believe in you and your independence is protected?
The first thing is to say that before we come to the end of the term, during the tenure of a commissioner, the tenure is protected in the Constitution and in the law as well.
Right, so it can't touch you for 7 years.
Which means that even if the president wants to touch you, as you put it, there are processes in place.
Right. Okay.
Can't just wake up and say you're fired. I've heard of situations on the continent where the head of state wakes up and say all members have dissolved.
Right, you're gone.
The Electoral Commission, you are all gone, and then sure. I'm naming a new commission.
Yeah.
It can't happen because the tenure is protected in the Constitution and in the law. And after the end of 7 years, really, it's not also up to the president.
Right.
You know that, because the president really just officially appoints people who have been given to him after a very long process.
Right.
There's an advert in the newspaper calling for nominations. The people who have been nominated are interviewed by a panel that does not even consist of politicians, a panel headed by the Chief Justice.
Right.
And then that panel interviews people, and in our case came up with 10 names, which they submitted to a parliament, to a committee of parliament, right. which is a multi-party committee. That committee then chose out of the 10, 4. Then the 4 are the ones that went, the 4 names went to the National Assembly for a vote. So the president is giving those 4 names.
And he has to choose the chairman.
He has to choose from the 4. Names. If he doesn't like the 4 names, the right. whole process has to start afresh. He has to say, I don't like these 4 names. And the process has to go back right down to say, maybe out of these 10, let's choose other 4 names. But that is why it is very difficult for the president to do anything. I mean, right. if after 7 years, the president doesn't like me or like what I've done, yeah. it will not be up to him, because what will then happen is that there will be an advert calling for nominations, right. and the Chief Justice committee is the one that will decide whether to shortlist me or not if in the event I'm nominated.
Yeah. I think it's important to raise these issues because right now, as we said, it's still okay to a degree because, to a large extent, and I'm sure this is not something that you will agree publicly with me on, the ANC doesn't support and the expectation is that they would come back to be elected. But let's leave the politics aside and talk about the ANC. Let's talk about the broader African context. I've read several articles suggesting that there is a link between democracy and economic development and advancement. Yeah. When you look across Africa, do you see enough in the numerous elections, and I think last year was a record year for African elections, and I think this year is also going to be a very high number. Do you see that beginning to show that the respect for elections and the electoral process is beginning to bear fruit?
I think we're doing well if you look at the number of elections, as you have indicated, that are taking place on the continent. That is encouraging. We have very few cases of unconstitutional changes of government. We shouldn't be having any in the 21st century. Yeah. But we still have one or two, Madagascar, and those few. I think what we need to sharpen and to improve is the quality of the elections, to produce an outcome after an election that will be accepted by everybody, because I don't think the challenge where I stand is about elections. We do hold elections, most of us, regularly.
Elections.
We hold, but it's the outcome. Yeah. And the trend that begins to worry me is that the quality of the elections sometimes is not acceptable, and what then happens is that rulers sit around the table and distribute power among themselves. Yeah. And this phenomenon of a government of national unity. Yeah,
we've seen it in Kenya, we've seen it in Zimbabwe.
Yes, it worries me because if not properly handled, it has the potential of circumventing the will of the people. So it's a phenomenon that we have to watch quite carefully on our African continent, because we cannot have a growing situation where after every election, if one of the parties is not satisfied with the outcome, they then distribute power among themselves in that unconstitutionally. But at the heart of that, how do we then reach that point? I think an electoral management body also plays a very important part to that outcome, because if they don't conduct elections in a way that will produce an acceptable outcome, that's when trouble starts, and that's when people start looking for solutions outside the electoral process.
Absolutely. Advocate Tlakula, we have to leave it here, unfortunately, because I wanted to ask you one final question, but I've been told time has run out. But hopefully we can continue this conversation one day, and we can continue discussing how we can give perhaps the African Union the teeth that the IEC has here in South Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's it for this edition of Africa Prime. We're talking to Advocate Pansy Tlakula. She's the chairman, the new chairman of the South African Independent Electoral Commission. From all of us here, it's a good night.